Imbalance IT Solutions provides a unique consulting approach to transform your organization's data, cybersecurity, and hybrid cloud environments. We would like to welcome you to our podcast series we call The Balancing Act, discussing complex digital transformation. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hello, listeners out there. This is Ryan O'Halloran, VP of Security Strategy here at Imbalance IT, bringing you episode 12 of the Balancing Act podcast series on exploring VMware alternatives. Today, we are going to discuss a overview of what's driving the market to explore VMware alternatives and providing you a solid strategy for solution selection and a migration path. I think it's going to be a great episode. I have back with me here Imbalance's Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Michael Caplan. Michael, as always, great to see you.
Great to see you, Ryan. Thank you.
And Michael, let's jump right into it, man. To kick things off, can you give us kind of some background? I'm sure most of the folks that are listening to this have some idea of what's going on, but let's set the stage here with a quick synopsis on what got us here. Why are clients considering moving away? Why do they feel, hampered and held captive?
Yeah, so VMware for as long of a part of my career, they were roughly majority owned by EMC. EMC got bought by Dell. Eventually, throughout that process, they figured out, hey, within their shareholders, it probably makes sense to do a divestiture. When that happened, that's when Broadcom came in and bought VMware. And for a long, long time, it was a perpetual license for your core hypervisor, and then all of the ancillary components, your vSANs from a software-defined storage standpoint, your monitoring, everything that you had was a traditionally perpetual license. So clients got used to paying upfront the cost of the license, and then they would pay a much smaller portion, usually, a certain percentage of that as maintenance year over year, but that was, very, very small in comparison. When Broadcom came in, pivot the world where it is right now, where a lot of things are subscription based, they make the change to try and align closer to some of their competitors. And that led to these really dramatic spikes in maintenance costs for a lot of clients, where they feel like, okay, maybe I invested in the hypervisor, but then I also used a little bit of vSAN in a pocket of my environment, and that was maybe some dollar amount X. And now, because of the new licensing models that have been introduced, in some instances, we're hearing 3, 4, 5x what my annual maintenance was going to be. And of course, that leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, the natural gamut of emotions that you'll feel when, hey, I've gone from paying this, for 10, 15 plus years, and now I'm seeing a dramatically different price that I haven't budgeted for, and where I don't feel like I'm getting the, understanding from the Broadcom team that, hey, this is somewhat disruptive to annualized budgeting processes. It means that maybe certain projects have to be canceled depending on how you do your annual budgeting. And that's leading to a lot of clients, at least considering, hey, what are the alternatives in that space?
Yeah,
And I'll
I can
pause for
only.
just
Sorry, go ahead.
uh, no worries, Ryan. I just wanted to pause and just offer full transparency. Imbalance has been a Broadcom partner for since our inception. However, we just like to point it out there that as of a few weeks ago, we received the notice that we are terminated from the Broadcom partnership because we were at the tier that wasn't. Um, high enough in order to continue on in their partner program. So I just want to make sure that that's well understood. I don't like to hide any of that. And, just want to make sure that even though we're going to talk about whether or not clients should move, just, like to point that out from a transparency standpoint, just so that people don't think that we're necessarily jumping into this with trying to attack Broadcom or VMware. And that's certainly not what this, conversation is really about.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And the transparency is awesome. They're obviously, we're big fans of VMware in our careers, and we don't want to see it go away. We want to see our customers
Absolutely.
happy. And where I was going to go previously is I can't imagine the heartburn. I've seen it on our side that the budget holder has internally playing defense upstream to the CFO and then playing offense on their distribution. I mean,
Hmm.
it's terrible, right? Um, and there's a lot to consider now if you do want to make the move. Like when I mentioned the word captive earlier, one of the things
Yes,
that I've noticed is even though there has been such incredible increases, largely the bet that Broadcom made that people would not move off immediately, they placed a good bet on that because people were so entrenched in it. Um,
absolutely,
and
for
and
sure.
as you and as you know, there's all these unique integrations into data protection and other things, even outside of the natural software, that are not easy things to just rip and replace or to, find features and parity if you're moving to some, open KVM or Kubernetes or some other type of solution. So, what are the things to consider when clients are ready to make the move? Because, VMware has so many form factors depending
Yep.
on how you've converged or hyper converged, where your storage is at, all these other things. I'd love to hear your take on, what drivers are there for you to be able to even plan to make the move, because it's definitely more of an iterative jump and not a big bang for most customers with where they're at in their life cycle. Would you agree?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ryan. It's a lot of the initial conversations that are, Imbalance has been engaged on have largely been driven by, for lack of a better term, it's been emotional. It's, hey, I feel
Yeah.
burned by Broadcom. I feel burned by their unwillingness to hear anything out. It's just, hey, one day it just went from the previous pricing model to this current one, and now I feel like I'm being forced into buying additional, software that I don't necessarily need or have a plan to utilize. Okay, what are my alternatives? And a lot of where we start our conversation is, let's level set around, what do you have today? What are you using in their ecosystem? What are your applications? When you think about certain specialized verticals like healthcare, some of these healthcare applications have specific requirements. So we try and create that understandable baseline, both from a technical standpoint, understanding, do you have specific software vendors that you buy from that haven't moved into maybe a SaaS model? You know, do they have a requirement that it has to run on VMware because that's all that they've certified and approved? And if you move to a different hypervisor, whether it's, Hyper-V, Azure Local, Nutanix, whatever, do they even support that as an underlying hypervisor? Or if something goes wrong, do they just say, well, we aren't familiar with this and we can't support that? you know, Understanding what have you built from an automation standpoint. If you've invested in something like ARIA automation, that becomes a much, different conversation, a much different animal, because hey, if you
Mhm.
have this service catalog where your users used to go in to request, certain VMs, certain types of applications, your SQL hosts, your IIS hosts, that becomes a lot harder to kind of rebuild. So if that's going to be your front end still, then you have to even consider, do I have to change to, an alternative platform entirely? From a security standpoint, do you have specific integrations within your VMware portfolio? Are you using maybe some of their software-defined networking capabilities? And then, you get into the obvious things. What does my team skill set look like?
Skill set,
Who
man. Yeah, I was gonna say so often.
which is
Yeah,
so much harder to even begin to wrap your mind around, because some of these alternatives, which are really really popular, you still see, the adoption is just, in the tens of percent, as opposed to VMware, which, has a, probably in that 80s plus percent adoption rate. So people who have been using VMware for years and years and years, the transition shouldn't be that hard, but still, you have to have a team and a culture that's also willing to potentially go through a little bit of that pain, go through a little bit of that friction. And then, of course, the biggest concern will always come down to what's the dollars and cents of it all. And, if you're want to leverage your existing infrastructure, that becomes an even harder conversation because certain solutions out there require you to basically move to an entirely different platform. And if you've just gone through a refresh cycle and have 4 years of remaining depreciation, that becomes a lot harder of a conversation. So then the conversation typically pivots at any particular size of client. When do you maybe just draw a line in the sand? Okay, this is going to be our infrastructure, and slowly but surely we're going to do that refresh. And move to potentially an alternative platform, or hey, we're feeling burned by this. At this point, we might as well just migrate everything into, the public cloud of some kind, your AWSs, your Azures, your GCPs, just because we don't want to have to feel like we're going to continuously get these, dramatic spikes in costs. So that becomes a lot of the generalized conversation that we have, and it takes a lot of thought and effort because it's not just as simple as I want to switch hypervisors. It's okay, does my backup system even support the new platform that I want to migrate to? What about my operating systems? All of these things that seem simple and trivial, when you're upset about the situation at hand. But if you take a step back, it really requires a lot more thoughtful effort in terms of how you want to truly approach, uh, whether it's a wholesale migration or even a partial migration, just to at least have, an alternative in place in the event that there is another pricing change or something else happens.
Yeah, and forecasting what might happen in the future, now understanding where you're at with that, it's scary, because
Hmm.
it's not just a matter of how can I, sometimes it's can I at all. And
Absolutely.
that's a really weird place to be in, and so often you mentioned culture and management, right? So often when we're solutioning, whether it's security or cloud or data center or whatever, it really comes down to the outcomes they're going to get because of what they're comfortable with. So a
For
lot of
sure.
times it's very much, what does this look like? And to move from, for instance, being a VMware certified professional and having 10, 15 years experience and you're having your whole career based around that, to
Yep.
now I'm going to shift to, running containers or something. That's a tough pill to swallow, and on
Absolutely
that,
is.
and on that note, um, there's obviously some technical risk in the move, even if you can, and then some financial impacts, when reassessing it. Could you talk a little bit about how you discuss risk with their clients? Because then it's also how do I, once we migrate, how do I secure it now? And like, and how do I feel like I'm in parity with how I fortified VMware over 10 or 15 years and things like that. I'd love to hear your perspective on, operatively and financially where those
Sure.
discussions get a little bit deeper.
Yeah, and I think first and foremost in a lot of our conversations, again, just for the sake of transparency, when if you take the feelings out of the mix, if you just look at the just purely a TCO standpoint, regardless of which platform you end up choosing, if you look at an alternative and assuming you can even just leverage your existing hardware, it's pretty rare that we'll see a positive TCO and ROI. Just is what it is. And usually the conversation then
Yeah.
becomes, okay, if you're trying to drive out some incremental savings, are you willing to potentially forego certain solutions that you've maybe invested in over time? Hey, if you do have a big investment in vSAN, okay, that one's maybe a little bit harder. But if you are just, for example, Enterprise Plus, and you have enough, compute that you're not experiencing server failures, because the servers aren't, terribly old, so they aren't hitting their kind of mean time between failures, and then you have enough, compute capacity to be able to handle, restarts. Are you maybe willing to go from Enterprise Plus down to vSphere Standard because it's less than half the cost per core per year from a licensing standpoint? But then if you just, just try and compare the hypervisor apples to apples. I hate making a joke about it, but Broadcom knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly how to price it to create enough pain for their clients that it was upsetting, but not so much that it made the TCO positive.
Yeah.
And
This
it's a
was a
very
blunt object.
yes, it works. It worked
It
because,
worked.
hey, to do a transition, some clients we're seeing absolutely are doing that because it they feel like they can't trust their vendor anymore to say they're not going to experience a ratchet tightening on the pricing again, so they just want to explore somebody else who already had that model in place, but they don't feel like will necessarily be trying to price me out of being able to run my business.
How much
But when you go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, how much tolerance have you seen of the customer to just bite the bullet versus kind of fight back a little bit? And have they won in any cases getting some reduction, getting some relief, or has it just been a hard no, this is what it is, no matter what? What have you seen out there? Is it primarily a zero tolerance policy for negotiation?
That's a great question. So it really will depend on the software like license that you're actually looking at from a Broadcom perspective.
Okay.
If you want to stick with just the core hypervisor components with vSphere Standard or vSphere Enterprise, there's basically, the price is the price. There's no negotiating around it. And they've fundamentally disincentivize their channel partners from trying to sell that, because it's basically you're just running the transaction. There's no fundamental benefit for anybody running that project together. So if a client wants to pursue the two levels above Enterprise Plus from leveraging whether it's vSphere vSphere Foundation or vCloud Foundation, that's when there is some willingness to negotiate. But hopefully at that point, the client is an existing long-term VMware client that has leveraged these multiple solutions, whether it's ARIA operations for monitoring, ARIA automation for leveraging a service catalog and automation deployment, things like what historically was Site Recovery Manager. If you've leveraged a lot of those solutions, okay, then maybe the transition to vCloud Foundation won't be as severe, even if whether or not you use, vSAN in your environment, or whether you're still kind of more historically three-tier or disaggregated HCI, depending on what preferred buzzword you like to use. That's when we'll see a little bit of flexibility in terms of negotiation, but that's also where usually is the starting point for Broadcom reps trying to convince their clients to move towards those licenses. But if you don't have any plans to, then you really don't have much in the way of flexibility of saying, hey, can I move from, you know, whatever the current dollar per core per month is, Enterprise Plus, if it's a 1-year renewal, for example, it's like roughly 150 per core per year. There's no flexibility there. It's, you get a little bit of a pricing reduction if you go to 3 years or longer from a renewal, but it's not, anything substantial enough where all of a sudden it's the cost, or you can't negotiate half the cost out of it. So then it becomes the conversation, to certain clients, do I look at even pivoting to refreshing my hardware to get to the appropriate core count and do some right sizing that way? Again, not something I highly recommend necessarily just jumping into without evaluating what the true total TCO and ROI is, unless your servers are at that point fully depreciated. But those are just the areas that you'll see. You'll have more flexibility if you want to go full vCloud Foundation and a multi-year, purchase or renewal. But if you're just keeping to the core hypervisor, there, it's kind of use it or lose it at that point.
Understood. Let's talk options.
Mhm.
So we talked about embracing a change as a culture. I would
Yes.
think, correct me if I'm wrong, that the lowest operative, their lowest friction operative change would be moving to public cloud.
Yes.
But I know there's also obviously other options as well, different
Mhm.
hypervisors, different hyperconverged solutions, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about what the options are so that customers can kind of get a handle
Sure.
on hey, what are the 4 or 5 things that I might be able to do? And then I'd love to hear your perspective on cloud acceleration, because that's something that's already started to be adopted. So to me, versus changing the skill set of my whole team or changing
Hmm.
all the platform that I have and resecuring it, all that, offloading some of that into the cloud where maybe some of that work is already done probably seems
Yep.
like the logical choice.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. When this transition first happened, and even with some of the kind of macroeconomic uncertainty with, tariffs and other things where certain budgets were feeling constrained from even doing if you still leverage an existing on-premises environment, hey, the cost of my hardware is now going to be so astronomical that, maybe it's a time to consider moving into the public cloud, where at least now the pricing is, predictable, assuming no major changes, price increases there as a result of the, economies of scale being impacted from, tariffs or what have you. So, your Azures, your AWSs, and your GCPs, those are what we would typically see as kind of the de facto decision. Okay, we're just
Yeah.
going to exit the data center business, no longer have to worry about it. But hey, if I have certain operating systems that are old, if I have certain applications that aren't ready for the public cloud, or they're just so far away from where the workload needs to operate, I still need a presence in, an existing on-premises facility or at the edge. It's really tough to necessarily jump into something like that. So, if you look at kind of the big four in your existing on-premises world that we would typically see, you have your Nutanixes, you have your Azure Local, which, is your historical Hyper-V, along with, the secret sauce that basically gives you Azure in a box. You have OpenShift virtualization, which pairs with the container platform from Red Hat with OpenShift, and uses KubeVirt, where you basically can manage virtual machines via containers. And then, one of the newest ones that I wouldn't necessarily expect to be ready just this moment, but is going to, you more than likely will see a very big push over the next 12 months. HPE has their VM Essentials as part of their Morpheus acquisition. It's built on their KVM, and they're aiming for, you just need your classic hypervisor, don't need a lot of the bells and whistles. It's a very attractive, dollar per socket. So going back to like the per socket license, the way that VMware used to be licensed per year with no core restrictions or anything along those lines. So those are the four that we would typically see. And then, every now and again, depending on the use case, depending on the location, we'll occasionally see clients evaluating things like Proxmox, which is an open source hypervisor. If you've historically maybe in healthcare, I've seen a little bit of, do we just use Zen because we still have to use, Citrix for, application presentation with Epic, Canonical based on, you know, their, depends on which version of Canonical you look at. Scale Computing, they have their own hyper-converged infrastructure. And then even if you just don't even want the full OpenShift virtualization and maybe some of the licensing with Red Hat, then you can even look at just something traditional like KubeVirt, which again, you need the team that's comfortable with containers first, that's also now willing to convert and manage virtual machines as containers,
That
which
seems
can
that seems the
sometimes
hardest.
feel, again, it really comes back to that previous conversation that we had around skill set. How
Yeah.
much is your team willing to learn? How much is your team willing to invest in that learning? And how much patience will the business accept with the fact that there will probably be some trial and error that's associated with some of this? If they can accept all of those things in conjunction, then okay, maybe it's not such a painful experience. But hey, if you just have one person on the team that's like, I want to learn this, but all of a sudden you just start seeing, a series of reboots or, containers shut down and then powered up again. And it could be very disruptive to the business
Yeah.
if you
Maybe
aren't
people
willing to
leaving their
invest that.
job. Maybe people leaving their
Absolutely.
job. Like, hey, I
Yeah,
don't want to manage this. This isn't what I was looking for,
there are people that like both the business as usual, and there are also the people that, hey, they get trained on this new thing, and because the skill sets are still very low, they can now go and look at, who's the highest bidder for my services because I'm very skilled now in OpenShift or Azure or what
Yeah.
have you, and now they can, potentially use that as a means of negotiation of salary. And though, again, just all of those considerations just have to be made when figuring out what that potential alternative might be. So we'll see those alternatives, and then it's really coming down to, what do you care about? What is your platform of choice going to be? What are my investments? And is there a way of leveraging existing infrastructure, especially in an on-premises world? Is there a way to re-leverage that? Some instances it's yes, some instances it's no, and that again just can potentially blow out the solution cost if you kind of scale it that way. And then, you know, I really enjoy the open source community. I think it's very powerful, but again, it comes down to the tolerance of risk, back to the security conversation. I know you probably would love that. When you move more towards open source, if there are issues, if there are vulnerabilities, you're really beholden to the community in terms of figuring out what that solution is and how quickly they can issue a patch or help you get the response. And in some instances, maybe there's a support desk somewhere that's kind of managing the project and can help, but then you might be beholden to a completely different time zone apart from your business hours. And if they're not available, then you could have a potentially extended outage, or just unnecessary risk, especially in highly regulated environments.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. So, you know, it sounds like there is a way potentially, but a lot to
There
think
absolutely
about.
is.
Now, I know every customer is different, in terms of the amounts of workloads they're running and what this would take to get off. But generally speaking, for the customers that are going to make the move, what do
Mhm.
you see, just in broad strokes, obviously, how long do you see these migrations potentially taking?
Honestly, depending on the solution, a lot of them have just native converters of your virtual machines. So as long as you follow, if you follow ITIL processes, you insert your change control, you do your
Good
probable
change
testing on
management.
some good change management, you do your testing on, test VMs. Hey, I want to create a fictional version of this application, or maybe a dev environment of this application. Let me do the conversion and then have my application team test and validate. Okay, this, non-prod instance of this environment moved over just fine. And do all of that, do probably your tier 4, tier 5 applications first, and then you slowly but surely migrate into kind of your core and critical applications. And you do that iteratively. And again, most of these solutions make it relatively straightforward. It's just there is, some level of downtime that's going to be required in order to complete this migration, complete that conversion, and it's really just a matter of, actually converting the bits into the format that, your Azure locals will care about, your Nutanixes will care about, your OpenShifts will care about. If you do that, then it can be relatively straightforward. And like we've, previously talked about, Ryan, it's pretty rare that you're going to see a full-fledged migration. You're not going to do, 10,000 VMs over a weekend. There's going to be, it probably then becomes a month-long process because you're going to have application teams approve the change, do all the testing, and validate that they're comfortable with it. And, certain application teams hold a little bit more sway over how quickly or how often things will be converted. Sometimes in certain highly regulated industries, think financial services, maybe those changes can only happen once a year. So that could be
Yeah,
the
I
long pole in the tent.
require much more risk management process in order to be able to
Or
even identify rollback, plan B, those things. Some of those things take a while to get through.
absolutely, or I've worked in pharmaceuticals before, and in some of the manufacturing plants require FDA approval. You have to have full documentation around, here's exactly how my environment's built, here's how I ensure that operations are good and and approved, and you have to have all of that documentation tested and validated so that it's agreed to, and that the FDA, if they came in and said, hey, I want to see what your processes look like from an IT perspective, you would have all of that, and you need that type of approval chain and documentation created. And that can also take a lot of time too. And
Yeah.
again, those were the instances where they only get downtime maybe once or twice a year, because the rest of the time they're operating an environment that's helping to produce, potentially life-saving medication, and they can't just always take the necessary time and outage there. So again, those are just some of the considerations that you have to make. But otherwise, the actual process itself, it's pretty straightforward and pretty well documented with, most of these platforms out there. And then it's just a matter of time.
Last question for you, Michael. There's a lot of folks on the inside of their organization, I'm sure, that are extremely uncomfortable just trying to research the options, trying to pitch this upstream and
Mhm.
explain this all away. What advice would you give IT leaders that just feel completely stuck and overwhelmed by this?
I think that's a great question, Ryan. I would say the feeling is well understood, and you're not alone out there in terms of feeling, hey, this feels very overwhelming. This feels like a lot of work. Unfortunately, it can be, but that's where partners like Imbalance and other members of the partner community that have all of these partnerships can help you with, what is that plan? What does that look like to do this migration? Help, what are the considerations that you have to make, and just make it very either conversational or structured, depending on how you need it. If it's, full on workshop or a full on
Yeah,
services engagement,
workshop or
yeah, you can absolutely, we do that quite regularly with our clients, in helping them, build that plan, understand that evaluation. And sometimes it just comes down to, hey, this doesn't make sense. We don't have the time because we have a backlog of too many projects. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, reach out to who you trust, who you want to work with, and help build those ideas out, because sometimes it can get stuck in your head, and sometimes it's just helpful to have somebody work with you to build out that documentation, have some of it maybe even pre-created, in terms of, hey, I'm going to help create this template and maybe put it on your organization's PowerPoint template, help you understand what those overall costs would be, build out that plan, and then help, with some of the gotchas that we've historically seen throughout our time. But sometimes it can be even as simple as, okay, start small, find, maybe a 3 or 4 host use case, do some testing, get the team at least willing to invest in what an exploration could look like, get comfortable with it, understand what that could be, and then maybe you iterate from there, or you determine, no, this just is not worth our time. Let's move to, ripping out maybe some of the software and moving towards just the core hypervisor. Those are the types of things that I would see. And again, you don't have to be in it by yourself. There's a full team behind you, and you have really great partners in this ecosystem that are feeling the exact same thing. We've felt it, we understand it, and we just, we're here to help. And I think that's the biggest thing that I can throw out there to anybody is, you may feel frustrated, you may feel stuck, but we help our clients get unstuck. We help create that balance, and we help figure out what that plan might be.
Michael, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time and insights on this. This is obviously affecting everybody very acutely, and as Michael said, Imbalance can help guide you towards this evaluation, selecting the right solution from you, alternatives potentially. So come have a workshop with us if you don't know where else to go. We would be happy to take you through this and the options and our experience to hopefully accelerate your decision making, or help you kind of describe what this looks like, whether your go forward hybrid, multi-cloud. Reach out to us today. You can hit us up at www.imbalanceit.com, and we can set up a discussion. Until next time, thank you all for listening.
In Balance IT Solutions wants to thank you for listening and invite you to join us for the next episode in our podcast series. Remember, In Balance IT Solutions can help you transform your business's technology, and we welcome you to reach out to us for more information on our website at inbalanceit.com. See you on the next one.